Hello, my name is Paul Zanazanian, and welcome to History in the Now Conversations, a podcast on history and how we use it in our everyday lives. History in the Now Conversations explores how we use history to know who we are, to know how to think and feel, and to know how to engage in our daily routines. History in the Now Conversations examines what history is, what it does, and how we can use it or even should use it in our everyday lives. Hello, this is Paul Zanazanian. I wanted to salute all my listeners and to take this opportunity to show my deep gratitude and to thank you for listening to my podcast series. I really hope you enjoy the discussions I have with my guests as much as I do. It'll be a year come this September that I started History in the Now Conversations. And to highlight the special moment, I thought I'd do something a little different, perhaps even something a little special for this month. I thought I'd share a Zoom presentation that I gave this past spring on my new book, Historical Consciousness and Practical Life, a Theory and Methodology. This whole podcast series is ultimately based on this book and emerges from the theory and methodology I present in it on history and historical consciousness. I was invited to give a Zoom seminar on April 17th this year, 2025, by Arthur Chapman, a professor of history education, and Catherine Wallace, a doctoral student, both at the Institute of Education at University College London in the UK. They kindly invited me to talk about my new book for the Institute of Education's History Education Special Interest Group. Both Arthur and Catherine recorded the seminar and generously sent it to me to post on my podcast. I would like to extend a warm thank you to both and to express my deep appreciation for their support. The purpose of today's episode is to talk about my book, but it also is to help you better understand what I am trying to do with my podcast, History in the Now Conversations, where I seek to discover people's everyday understandings and uses of history. I hope you enjoy the presentation and that it helps answer any questions or thoughts you may have. I will return to the podcast series' regular format next month in September for another full year of very stimulating conversations with non-historians who use history in their daily lives, both professionally and personally, with the clear aim to better understand what history is and how it works in its practical life uses. Thank you again for listening to my podcast. Please be well. Good afternoon from Montreal. My name is Paul Zanazanian, and I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to thank Katie Wallace and Arthur Chapman for inviting me and giving me this wonderful opportunity to talk about my new book that I've worked on for nearly over 10 years. I've been researching historical consciousness for over 20 years, and it took me 10 years to write this book. So my aim today is really to offer you a clear understanding of the key ideas from my new book, Historical Consciousness and Practical Life, a Theory and Methodology, which was published this year in 2025 by the University of Toronto Press. What I will present is what I believe to be a new novel way of conceiving historical consciousness and of examining it. I believe that my understanding of historical consciousness will help to better understand how humans construct and use historical knowledge in their everyday lives, especially when faced with life challenges, or what I like to call unexpected happenings that disrupt the regular flow of their lives. So underlying my understanding of historical consciousness, so before we start, I just want to provide some of the building blocks. I talk a lot about history, but I have a different understanding of history than what most people would probably assume history is. So the underlying conception of historical consciousness here is an embodied understanding of history, where history really functions to direct our sense making and where history really comes alive when faced with thinking problems related to life. So with this embodied understanding of history, there are two key features that I would like to also highlight before I start the presentation. And that is the concept of history in the now, where our ever present and continuous now follows us around and embeds and operationalizes our historical consciousness, where the sense making happens for action, and the practical life methodology, which is the second feature, which permits to examine the workings of our historical consciousness when negotiating how to make sense of unexpected happenings. So these unexpected happenings, greatly influenced by Carl Becker here, can happen in daily life, they can happen throughout our personal lives, or they can also constitute social problems with historical roots. So what I'll do is I'm going to start off with a little discussion to set the stage. Then I'm going to talk about my personal and scholarly pathways and how they intersect. And you'll see that a lot of my personal life experiences have been put into developing this book. Then I'll go on and describe the book's main cast of characters or the key concepts and definitions. I will provide then a brief overview of the methodology and analytical process. I'll briefly describe the Quebec context where I look at community leaders from the province's English-speaking minority and how they interact and engage with a major unexpected life happening that took place or a social problem with historical roots and how they interact and engage with that. And I'll present the results after that. And then I'll talk about one main contribution from this project. There are several. And then I'll talk about the pedagogical implications, and I'll end with some closing comments. So what I'd like to say is what I'm going to present is a bit heavy and a bit detailed, but I will try my best to keep it light and fun. And if you have any questions, I look forward to answering them at the end. So I apologize in advance if you wanted something light, but I kept that for the book launch. But for this presentation, I thought I'd try to get more into the nitty-gritty details. So what I'll do now is start off by setting the stage. As most of us would agree, life is not easy. When things seem to settle down, another problem or challenge seems to always arise. So the question I'd like to ask is, how do we react and seek to solve the many life challenges that we face, be they daily, personal, or social? Or more specifically, I'd like to ask, how do we act when unexpected happenings disrupt the regular flow of our lives? How do we employ the knowledge we possess for navigating any consequent challenges that arise? Is acting upon the basis of the certainty of the knowledge we possess advantageous, even if we know even if we know that it's incomplete? Or is it better to move forward and press on with an uncertainty of what we know, while all the while knowing that we need to learn more? Or do we always proceed in a way, in a state of ambiguity with how we carry on and with the information that directs us? So with my interest in history, I also ask, what role does history play to bring us to a happy state of equilibrium? So in following an embodied understanding of history, where history directs our sense making, history in a way helps us understand the world, but it also helps us, in a way, saves us and helps reestablish a certain equilibrium where we can maintain our dignity and integrity and feel or seek or tend towards feeling complete and fulfilled as human. So with these three opening questions, I'll break them down and say that this is what they ultimately amount to. How do we act when faced with thinking problems related to life? How is the history we embody activated, and how do we use it? And that is the main topic or conversation of the book. Now, more empirically, the book also looks at how we use historical knowledge in such situations where these unexpected happenings refer to social problems with historical roots. Earlier on, I talked about daily life, I talked about personal life problems and social problems. In this book, I go deeper into the social problems with historical roots. Today, we are faced with many challenges, right? Our already complex and deeply interrelated, mutually dependent, multicultural, and digital world is currently facing such challenges as climate change, a clashing of knowledge systems and ideologies, faster technological change, and the ever present need of making better room for marginalized peoples in our imperfect societal structures. So, how can we make sense of these challenges, of these social problems with historical roots, to help regain our sense of self and presence, and to improve our ability to better understand and navigate our different worlds? So, the aim ultimately with my ongoing work on historical consciousness and in writing this book is really to reinvigorate our interest in historical consciousness by focusing on history's practical life uses. I ultimately seek to find ways in which we can use history or our embodied history, to find the different ways we can use our embodied history to improve the world we live in. So I seek to reinvigorate interest in historical consciousness to help model our thoughts and how to better understand people's sense making processes when using history. The aim ultimately is to understand how we use history in everyday life and then to build on that and to foster positive change for our personal and social selves. And ultimately, in using a practical life approach to grasping our understanding of our embodied understanding of history, by using such an approach, what I find beneficial is that we can enter the mind of the sense maker, which is what the practical life methodology does. And we can see what is happening. And once we enter the mind of the sense maker and see what is happening, then we can develop strategies to improve things. So there's a key working assumption that underlies my aim. And ultimately, if history is to help make change, if our embodied history is meant to make change and to help us make change, then what is required is our reflexivity, or our ability to constantly question the knowledge we possess and to take critical distance from the knowledge claims we produce. This constant problematizing of the knowledge we possess can lead us to having an open mind, I like to believe, and can give us hope for change. The idea is that we advance in life when we problematize and question what we take for granted in our self understanding, or if we make object what is subject, scrutinize it, ask questions, improve on it, and make it subject again. So, my vision of history is the following. The basic idea is that we are history. When our lives are disrupted, we are affected. We then use history to restore our balance, our dignity, and integrity. And then what arises ultimately becomes part of our heritage. You can see a bit of Heidegger in here, which now form part of our repertory of experiences for knowing and acting. And ultimately, change in the world, personal growth and development, or inner expansion happen through thinking reflexively about our heritage, our inherited history in our bodies, and what we are accustomed to, and by which we are, and what we are socialized into. So, by thinking reflexively about our heritage and the new life challenges we face, we can bring positive change if we think in a continuous reflexive manner. So, the rationale for this work is ultimately the world will become a better place once we democratize our construction and use of historical knowledge. Democratizing history for me doesn't mean having students to think like historians or to aim for thinking like historians, but it really means making room for and celebrating our embodied history and working with that as a starting point to make change. It's where we come to better understand, respect, and make room for individual, cultural, epistemological differences in our sense making of time's movement, of who we are, of our presence in the world, and our contributions to the world. The more we have opportunities to feel complete and fulfilled as humans while maintaining our sense of integrity and dignity, the more we will be better positioned to engage with others on an equal footing. If everyone can do this, perhaps it can foster openness to differences, a oneness as humans, and perhaps make the world a better place. My pathways. So, I have two pathways I'd like to talk about. The first is my own life story. I never really talked about my own life story, but I think it's really relevant to the work I'm doing. So, I've been studying the concept of historical consciousness for over 20 years now. The source of this interest really lies in my childhood, with my questioning of my identity and how I fit into the world. There was this dual inheritance which came to form a constant tension in my identity and self understanding that I still have to contend with, and that really was more bothersome when I was growing up. On the one hand, through my father, I inherited the experiences of those who lose and keep on losing, stories of persecution and migration, embodied memories of a major traumatic historical atrocity and its aftermath, and of living in a diasporic community. Through my mother, I inherited the opposite, the experiences of those who win and keep on winning. I inherited a history, an embodied history of greatness descending from the originators of a powerful empire. So there was this constant tension between those who keep on losing and those who keep on winning. And that really, as a young kid, that really affected me. And then this is something that I forgot until recently. I myself have lived my own trauma without realizing. I'll explain now. I was born on the Mediterranean coast during a civil war, a bloody civil war. My father at that time had left because he got his first well-paying job and he moved. And my mom, being a foreigner in that land, was there alone with other family members, like the in-laws. But during this war, I know stories have been told that I've spent 10 days in a bomb shelter, 10 days and 10 nights. And I was a sickly child, and my mom had to at one point run across sniper fire to our home to bring medication. And another story I was told about that time is that when we got home, my mom and my sister found an unexploded bomb, or a bomb that was half detonated. But all I do know is my mom and my sister, who was 5 years old at the time, had to carry that bomb down into the parking lot, and the boys in the neighborhood were the ones who took charge and took care of it. So growing up, I blocked this lived trauma, but it's still there. But what I did engage with was my two inherited legacy, the experiences of those who lose and keep on losing, and the experiences of those who win and keep on winning. And this contradiction, like I said, played both with my mind. I felt like both a loser and a winner. Because of this tension, I forgot to mention, I started reflecting on life's absurdity. How absurd is it that I was both a loser and a winner? How absurd is it that one minute we're here and the next minute we're gone, like in war? Or how absurd is it that people can kill each other for no reason? And like in the old photos of my mom's family that I would watch, how absurd is these people were here and they're no longer here? What happened to them and the stories? So your mind starts traveling. So I would gather books to learn more, but I never actually really read them. I gathered books to read more about my inherited experiences, but I never really read them. I guess the pain of losing and being a loser was too great. So I would instead get more pleasure by looking at photographs, old photographs, and looking at black and white pictures and imagining the lives that people were living. I would also, as I grew older, go to antique stores, especially when we moved to Canada as a kid, and I would look at old books and I would open the old books, antique books, and sniff and smell. And I used to love smelling antique books. I don't know if you can relate, but I used to love that. And what I found really fascinating about looking at old pictures and smelling books was that time would stand still. I would imagine and smell or look at the pictures, and there was no past, present, future. I was just in the now moment. And this is what I'm trying to capture in the book. In retrospect, looking at the old photos and sniffing old antique books were a form of reflexive thinking that have stayed with me. By smelling and sniffing, I started to ask questions, and then I started asking questions about my own questions, and I started becoming very reflexive in my thinking. So this gained reflexivity, where I was able to think and reflect on my thinking, made me realize that at times I could be very emotional about my past, and at other times I could be very nuanced. I could take critical distance. But it was interesting because there are days, depending on how I felt, I would take critical distance from my knowledge claims, and at other times I would not be able to. And I was angry and upset with what happened to the losers of my side, of my father's side of the family. So it's really interesting to keep this in mind, because as I grew older and I decided to do my PhD, I wanted to better understand this phenomenon. I was wondering, what would other people do in such situations? Did they switch? Are they able to take critical distance and then one day decide not to? And as my research has shown, it's very common and it happens often. There are people who are able to take critical distance from their knowledge claims when engaging with social problems with historical roots, but for political, ethical, and practical reasons, they decide not to. And all this started with my own research in 2003 when I started my PhD, when I was linking historical consciousness to notions of ethnicity and the structuring of group boundaries. I won't go in detail, but I'll just say that then I looked at minority group interactions with official dominant state narratives, narrative, metaphor, schematic templates, group vitality, community leaders, and mobilization of concerted social action, sense making, positionality, reflexivity. These are all my different research projects, and they have come to help me form this book. But one thing I do want to mention briefly is that I was greatly influenced by a lot of people who know him, by Jorn Roosen, who I believe set the foundations for helping connect historical consciousness to notions of human agency. I also looked at the work of James Wurst, whose approach to sociocultural theory and mediated action and schematic narrative templates helped me further my thinking. And ultimately, my book is a mix, a melange or a collage of both their ideas, but I build on them and I take them further. So to explain, my whole idea of history as interpretive filter and the templates really emerged when I tried to apply Roosen's framework of historical consciousness to the structuring of group boundaries, where ethnic, quote unquote, ethnic group members would negotiate where they stood with pre-given significations of how power holders would tell them how the past was with the significant other and how they would use that information then to position themselves and structure their boundaries. And I thought ultimately in following Roosen's lead, that the genetic type would help people be more open to differences and the boundaries would be less porous. But what I found was that even if people were able to have a genetic mindset in the terms according to the definition of Roosen, where we recognize the complexity of human life, where we recognize the temporality of human forms of thought, where we recognize the variability of time, and we do express a recurring need to improve meanings given to the past, even if we have a genetic mindset, depending on the time and day, we can refuse to for political, ethical, and practical reasons. And what I realized was that through this work, what we needed to study was the underlying logic to how history works in people's sense making. And I found Roosen's work interesting, but I found it very descriptive of different types of interactions. But I wanted something that would permit me to go into the mind of the sense maker. And this is one of the reasons why I ended up looking toward the practical life approach. And you'll see what I mean. And then looking to sociocultural theory and mediated action, where I came to realize that the way we make sense of the way we use history as an intellectual mode of thought for making sense of the world is part of our cultural memory and not just the stories we recite of the past being what a lot of people like James Wurst would focus on when he talked about schematic narrative templates. So ultimately, the constant finding is that people demonstrate the ability to take critical distance from their knowledge claims when making sense of the significant other and other community situation or condition, but they can easily refuse to for political, ethical, and practical reasons. To better understand this switch in people's positioning, I came to believe that any gained insight into the reason behind how and why we structure the knowledge, the histories that we do, the logic behind our thinking, historical sense making, is where the answers lay. So this ultimately led to the book. So ultimately, the book examines how we use history in our everyday lives, how we construct and employ historical knowledge in our minds to help us navigate daily life problems, personal life problems, as well as the bigger social problems with historical roots. To proceed with this examination, I used a sociocultural approach to sense making via Wurst's notion of mediated action, where instead of humans being storytelling animals, we are tool users and we use tools. And basically, in a nutshell, through mediated action, I, Paul Zanazanian, am not the author of my agency. It's the conceptual resources of the cultural tools and Paul Zanazanian, who are the co-authors of Paul Zanazanian's agency. So the practical life methodology, which is what I promote in the book, I use that to investigate the mental tools or the schematic narrative templates we use to help us create meaning and to examine what they look like when we produce historical knowledge. We all have these tools in our mental toolkits and we use them in our own way. We use mental tools to shape how we think, feel, and act. We use mental tools to inform our attitude and mindsets. We use mental tools to inform how we position ourselves. We employ history in this manner in our daily lives and our personal lives when dealing with social problems with historical roots. So the practical life methodology, which is the theme of the book, can help capture how our mental tools work. And ultimately, like I mentioned earlier, analyzing the workings of our historical consciousness via this mediated action approach allows us to enter the mind of the meaning maker, especially when deciding on how to act. We can enter the mind of the tool user, the meaning maker. So, two questions guide the practical life methodology. What mental mechanisms help frame uses of historical information so that meaning is created? And then, how does such meaning consequently function so that individuals evaluate where they stand and know how to proceed? So here are my cast of characters, the key concepts and ideas. Historical consciousness, history in the now, the practical life methodology, two types of mental tools or schematic narrative templates, history as interpretive filter, and history as content configuration, and the notion of enactment, which shows us how we use our mental tools in our real-time applications of it. So I'll go briefly through the cast of characters so that you know what I'm talking about. So as mentioned earlier, history really is an embodied source of knowledge that directs our sense making. It's a cultural and practical activity that happens regularly in people's everyday lives. We are history, and history directs our sense making. It helps us give meaning to time's movement, especially when confronted with life challenges or those unexpected happenings that disrupt the regular flow of our lives or the social problems with historical roots. Historical consciousness, in turn, refers to our capacity to create and employ historical knowledge to make sense of time's flow, and then to use that information to propel our actions in our ever-changing environment. In this definition, you can definitely see Jorn Roossen's influence, but it's a little deviated in a way. It goes in a different direction. And then history in the now really is where the operationalization of our historical consciousness happens. It's part of history in the now itself works to grasp the functioning of our historicity and time's flow. So we always say that with modernity, we realize that humans are inserted in time, and our thinking is inserted in time. I argue that our historicity doesn't happen in time, it happens in our now, in our present moment that follows us around, the ever-present now, the continuous now that follows us and that we can never escape. It serves as a launching pad where we create historical knowledge and use it to navigate the world and social reality. It's the source. The now is the source of our sense making. It's where it's located. And it's an embodied mental time-space zone that is always present in our minds and that produces meaning out of the fluid and senseless reality that we are faced with. And it enables us to grow, ask questions, critique, and reposition ourselves as we engage with the world. So history really happens in the now moment where we use, and the now moment is layered. It's not just when we're alert, it's also the subconscious, because the templates that we use are incognizant thinking frames that structure and direct our thinking. We'll get to that in a moment. So this leads next to our next character, and that's the practical life methodology. So in using a mediated action approach from sociocultural theory, it helps examine historical consciousness's workings through inductive means of reading data by collecting the meanings that surface from firsthand understandings of reality and drawing important questions. It really looks at humans as tool-using beings and not storytelling animals. And it really examines the construction and use of historical knowledge in people's real-time sense-making. And it helps us assess the extent to which we are reflexive in our thinking and the extent to which we are able to take critical distance from the knowledge claims we make. So the two tools that come to mind, not that come to mind, there are two tools. So I just want to clarify that these are all ideational constructs that are not necessarily what happens in the real world, but these are speculative and tentative explanations of how the world works. So I wanted to mention that. And the reason why is because history as interpretive filter and history as content configuration don't necessarily exist like physically or materially in the world, but they're they're information that we try to induce or pull out or draw inductively to understand how we engage with social reality. So there are two mental tools: schematic narrative templates, history as interpretive filter, and history as content configuration. History as interpretive filter really refers to those templates that help structure how we understand and use history as a reading lens for interpreting the social problems we encounter. Our understanding of how history works as a leading reading lens, interpretive filter for constructing knowledge, which is part of our cultural memory. And this is influenced by the next point, the next template, which is what Wurst and others refer to when they think about schematic narrative templates. I call it history as content configuration. These are templates that structure how we narrate the story over time of the social problem we encounter and seek to solve, or of the group we are interested in helping. An enactment, as I mentioned earlier, is how we put these templates into effect, how we use them in our real-time applications. And to capture enactment really involves reading through data and grasping the logic behind how the interpreters that we are analyzing construct and employ historical knowledge in real time, and the feedback they provide, written feedback. I'll get to that in a moment. So ultimately, the practical life methodology involves two steps. First is reading how individuals structure their thinking when making historical sense of social reality. This means identifying and describing the two templates I just mentioned through a guided reflection piece and an open-ended historical narrative, and to also read how they enact the knowledge claims they consequently make. Basically, identifying enactment means how they use the templates or put them into effect. And this again is gained by looking at how individuals view, construct, and employ historical knowledge in their data when making claims. And what I want to keep in mind, have you keep in mind, is that we enter thinking problems, life problems, to when life problems would be the unexpected challenges or the social problems. So we enter a thinking problem with these incognizant frames. So we have a pre-given understanding of what history is and what it can do. And depending on the social problem or the problem that we're trying to solve, we will enter the thinking problem incognizantly with these templates. But the way we terminate and finalize our sense making depends on enactment. I'm going to give you an example in a moment and you'll see what I mean. So another assumption: the more individuals recognize reality's complexity and the difficulty in creating reliable knowledge while being able to take critical distance from the claims they make, the more the chances I believe they'll be able to find solutions that are win-win for all those involved, especially when it comes to solving social problems. So ultimately, although we're all on different pathways, I believe that reflexive thinking can lead us to our ability to take critical distance from knowledge claims and to want to, if we are really reflexive and authentic about it. Another thing I want to mention is the practical life methodology only offers one glimpse of people's sense making of one social problem of historical nature in one moment in time. Just because someone may have a certain form of enactment when they're using their tools, that doesn't mean they're going to use the same tools or enact the tools in the same way for other social problems. Again, it depends on context, like I was saying. So now I'm not going to go into detail, but this is the analytical process. I offer a lot of information in the book on this. I talk about the methodology. I talk about the methods. I also offer step-by-step prompts, and I offer two appendices where I show how the coding can be done. All that information is available, but just to highlight that in order to capture history as interpretive filter templates, so all this data, participants write them in one sitting. And it's me trying to induce this information from what they say to understand what's happening in their minds, in their brains when providing this information. So the first step is identifying and describing the templates. So for history as interpretive filter, it's usually done by what I call a guided reflection piece, where participants are asked to best describe a moment in time where they had to justify the importance of using history for attaining a goal or making social change. And I really ask them to make sure that they explain their justification or their rationale for using history. Then for history as content configuration, here I'm really influenced by Jocelyn Letourneau, a Quebec historian, who has gathered a lot of data asking young Quebecers and others to recite the history of Quebec from the very beginnings until current times. So I really borrow the method for gathering data from him and his wonderful work. So these are the two templates. So we have a guided reflection piece and an open-ended historical narrative. I won't go into detail, but by using narrative analysis, we can reduce the narrative to their core structural elements, and then we group them according to the function of the actions of key protagonists. Shout out to Vladimir Prop. The protagonists for the guided reflection piece would be history, and for history as content configuration would be the we group that we are interested in. And then through metaphorical thinking, we can come up with the template structures. So I explain everything in the book in detail and in the prompts, and I show examples in the appendices. Then when it comes to identifying and describing enactment, again, the idea is to look at how people and their data use historical knowledge and what it looks like. I offer prompt questions in the book also and give examples. And to look at this information, I guess I was inspired by Weinberg, where he talks about mock reading, where you're looking for the subtext in texts. That's how historians read history. So you want to read in between the lines, and then you want to also be able to measure what arises. So I've used Kuhn and Weinstock's very famous tripartite model of epistemic thinking, the different steps, but I re-envision them as parallel and ideal type tendencies or as a measuring rod. You'll see I even re-envisioned Jorn Roossen's developmental, ontogenetic developmental typology of historical consciousness as parallel and equal ideal type tendencies. So I really love the notion of ideal type tendencies. The work of Max Weber was very helpful in that. Key findings. So Quebec is interesting. I draw on a study to illustrate how the practical life methodology works. I draw on a study I conducted on English-speaking community leaders from Quebec. So it's interesting because Quebec is very fertile when it comes to gathering data on national identity, belonging, issues of language, culture, memory come into play. Francophones constitute what my former PhD supervisor, I think it's her term, Mary McAndrew, the idea of the fragile majority, where Francophones are a majority in Quebec, but they're a minority in Canada and in North America. Anglophones in Quebec are a minority in Quebec, but they're a minority within a fragile majority. And they're also assumed to be part of the majority, English language majority in North America or in Canada. And one big social problem with historical roots that Anglophones are looking for. They're a recent sociological minority. There were language laws that were brought into place to help protect the French language and to offer socioeconomic mobility to Francophones who really were lower status citizens at one point prior to the 60s. So this created the Anglophone community, and now people who didn't leave remained here, and they want to be able to remain and survive as they're a community in their own right. So they want to basically be present, but they're seen as a threat to Francophone vitality, to the French language, and to the French culture. If you add to this the history of unequal power relations and difficulties in creating a common civic space between Anglophones and Francophones, and obviously our Indigenous peoples and other historic minorities, then you'll know why historical consciousness is fun to study in Quebec. So the study really, with this in mind, looks or examines English-speaking community leaders' historical consciousness and its impact on their sense of purpose and responsibility as community educators for strengthening their language groups' weakening vitality. So, in the book, I talk about 40 community leaders and how they position themselves for making change in light of this thinking problem of vitality, community vitality. And there are two main history as interpretive filter templates that arise, and one main history as content configuration. So in my view, and the research I've done over the years shows and points to how history as interpretive filter is the propeller of historical consciousness, of our historical sense making when historical consciousness is operationalized, and not necessarily the content configurations or the narratives we recite about prior times. So the first template that emerges is history is an instrument, for positive outcomes. So some community leaders, when they're entering the thinking problem of community vitality, and they hold power and influence and how they want to position themselves and influence group members. They enter the thinking problem without them realizing that history is an instrument for positive outcomes. And this incognizant frame or template guides their thinking through an incognizant understanding that history can constructively instruct people to cultivate their minds and to make change through a growth in comprehension. Now, there are other community leaders who use history in another incognizant way, and this is the template history is group empowerment. Note how I capitalize the names of these templates. That's my influence when I did a bit of work on metaphor. So history as group empowerment guides thinking, community leaders thinking through an incognizant understanding that history is more assertive, where it works to strike a chord and mobilize community members through a renewed understanding of the group. So history offers a renewed understanding of the group to mobilize them, and that's what history can do. Now, when it comes to their story or the history of their we group in Quebec, their history as content configuration, the vast majority of these 40 community leaders offered a history of reversal, where they were in power prior to the 60s, then they lost power after the 60s. So there's a reversal of their status. They lost power when Francophones took charge and they brought in the language laws and so forth. So from an original positive situation, they find themselves in a subsequent negative one. So brought together, these templates, what did they say about our thinking, community leaders' thinking? So when they enter a thinking problem in an incognizant manner, the core directing idea here is that despite a reversal of fortunes, using history to make change is either done constructively or in a more assertive manner. So I'm going to talk a little bit about mental tools. We have physical tools like a hammer, and we have mental tools or conceptual resources like schematic narrative templates. Just to explain how the stances work and how enactment works. Hammers can help us to physically build a house. Now, the way we use a hammer, the angle at which we hammer in the nails will have an impact on the outcome of the house. It'll be more sturdy or less sturdy. The same logic applies to mental tools. We need schematic narrative templates or other conceptual resources to conceive of historical knowledge and to create historical knowledge. But again, the way we use our mental tools can have an impact on how we make sense of the social problem we seek to solve. And it can provide insight into the extent to which our sense making is productive or not. So 5 key stances emerge from the data inductively. The first one, and you'll see a lot of similarities. So this is real-time sense making in people's historical consciousness, I would say. The first is one where knowledge is inherently objective. So for unimodal community leaders, historical knowledge is black and white, and it's easy to copy paste as needed. There's no nuance. For corrective community leaders, historical knowledge is black and white. It's inherently objective, but they use it specifically to correct wrong interpretations or misunderstandings. It's as if there's one true understanding of history, but it's hidden under layers of confusion, and your job is to ultimately show people what the true, correct understanding of history is. Then there's the experiential stance, where knowledge here is inherently subjective, where it's relative to the individual, and what really matters are their own lived and inherited experiences, those of family, community, and ancestors to guide them. Then you have the ideological stance, which I find really interesting. It's where knowledge is inherently emancipatory. A lot of these community leaders view history as a political act, and it can emancipate people, but some people use it towards negative ends. So they, as the self-anointed messengers, see history as a means of sharing a message or mobilizing people. So suggests that self-anointed messengers have an urgent message to share at all costs. Then you have the multimodal stance. As you can see, it's a total opposite of the unimodal stance. And this is where knowledge is seen as being inherently complex and must be treated with nuance and care. Historical knowledge is complex, hard to accurately grasp, and consequently needs to be handled with care and nuance. There is a willingness to take critical distance from one's knowledge claims and to demonstrate a more self-conscious and cautious approach when using history. So these are the 5 stances. But one main contribution, and I think this is really interesting and important to keep in mind, is I talked about how we use the hammer to hammer in nails for the house, less sturdy, more sturdy. The same thing for the schematic narrative templates. So the person who hammers may hold the hammer thinking that I am the best hammerer in the world and I'm going to hammer in and make this house sturdy. So their intentions are to be a cool and really good constructor, and they're going to hammer in that nail. But they may hammer it without them realizing at a wrong angle. So their intentions for hammering the nail start off as being self-confident, but the way that they hammer in the nail and the house is less sturdy, then their confidence maybe would still be there, but without them realizing it's not as productive. The outcome is not as productive. So our intentions for engaging with unexpected life happenings, according to the history as interpretive filter templates we use, may not always directly resonate with how we go about enacting our sense making. This points to a discrepancy between what we believe and want, our intentions, and what we really do, our actualization, as per the stances we employ. We may approach a social problem in a particular manner, but given the type of stance we employ, the way in which we hammer in the nail, our ideas may not follow through in the most productive way. So yes, these are fictitious names. So there's Sheena and Belinda. Sheena is an academic. She has a PhD. Belinda is an adult educator and she has a master's degree. They both are community organizers in different fields of competencies. But when participating in the study, what came to mind is that both share the same history as interpretive filter, and they both are able to see the complexity of the history of English-speaking Quebec. But one template obviously is complexity and the one is reversal. But what's interesting is Sheena, even with her PhD, decides that, yes, I'm able to take critical distance. I understand the nuances, but for her, message is more important than nuance when it comes to her sense making without her realizing. Without her realizing, message is more important than nuance, even though she's able to nuance. Then Belinda is able to nuance and she's able to see that the message is important, but she takes critical distance. And when you read her data on the book, it's really interesting because she finds a constructive way of leading group empowerment where she's able to, and maybe because she's an adult educator, I have no idea, but she's able to build on different marginalized groups' own experiences to help create a form of group empowerment that brings all English speakers together. But in doing that, she recognizes the complexity of reality and is very multimodal in her stance. So both Sheena and Belinda recognize reality's complexity and take critical distance from their thinking, but Sheena pushes it aside to promote her message, whereas Belinda embraces being multimodal. So there's this tension between intentions versus actualization. If we enter a historical thinking problem with a group empowerment template, but enact it differently, will the outcomes and expectations be the same in the creation and use of knowledge for making positive social change for all involved, or even for self-growth? Would alignment with a multimodal mindset get at more authentic uses of prior life experiences? Would it help to provide a sense of dignity and integrity in our daily life encounters? So I'm really wondering, like, what's the most productive way? And for this case, there's no real answer when it comes to multimodal and ideological, because depending on the case, some people say that no one's listening to us, so we need to promote the message until people listen. And then maybe once the status quo changes, then they'll be able to be more multimodal. I have no idea. But the questions I raise are the following. We may proceed with the idea that history can result in group empowerment by working to mobilize community members through a renewed understanding of the group. But the question is, which type of enactment would work the most productively? Would history result in group empowerment productively if we are less reflexive in our thinking and do not take critical distance from the claims we make? Or would history result in group empowerment productively if we are more reflexive and do take such critical distance? So ultimately, when it comes to education, I really believe that we can copy paste the same logic and structure of the practical life methodology when used for empirical research in the classroom. Obviously, it would depend on the level of, or on the type of students that one has. But ultimately, The pedagogical implications are there. And the aim here would not necessarily be to view history as something that historians do. I call it the ideal type historian. Not that we want students to think like historians, but the idea of the ideal type historian hovers over us, breathes down our necks, and tells us this is what history is. And there's this text I read by Penny Clark a while back, and she talks about the different rationales for teaching citizenship education. It's a simple text, but I love it because it's so powerful, and I use it with my students. Reality is complex. So do we want to teach students to engage with reality in the mode of disciplines, where there's more of a rigorous and I guess respected way of like what historians do, right? A methodology for engaging with reality? Or do you sometimes want to have students focus more on their personal growth and development and their inner expansion? So obviously not one is better than the other. Ultimately, you want to do two. But what I want to do with the practical life methodology, if it were to be used in a pedagogical setting, in a classroom setting, is to really help students understand that history is embodied in them and they are history, and history directs their sense making, and there's nothing wrong. You don't need external history to correct the way they think. If they do gain that kind of culture along the way, that's fine. If they do inherit it and integrate it into their heritage, that's fine. But we shouldn't necessarily see students as being in need of correcting. The ultimate way of countering that is having students be self-reflexive. Ultimately, with a practical life methodology, they'll capture when they look at and analyze, if they apply the methodology to themselves and they apply it to a social problem with historical roots, they can analyze their own templates, they can analyze their own enactment, they can compare and contrast, and then through that, they'll be able to be more self-reflexive in their thinking. And ultimately, I like to believe is that if we keep on being self-reflexive and asking questions about our questions, asking the questions about our knowledge gaps and why we ask those questions, at one point we'll be able to do the right thing and recognize that we are human and others are human and we need to respect each other. So ultimately, it's discovering the templates and how they enact them, and this can generate interesting discussions and foster self-discovery and openness to others. They can also gain insight into history's practical life uses and ultimately to know and discuss what it means to be human. And ultimately, through grasping the workings of history's embodied uses, the objective would be to foster their sense of inner expansion and to encourage students and learners to seek to want to feel fulfilled and complete as individuals, humans, members of society, global citizens, and beyond, all the while recognizing and encouraging the same need and drive within others. So the practical life methodology ultimately raises questions about the certainty of the knowledge we possess and our ability to grow and develop as humans with an open mind and in a win-win manner. In recognizing the difficulty in creating knowledge, we may perhaps be more open to expanding our way of thinking to include new approaches to our sense making, especially for addressing life happenings, problems with historical roots. So in being aware of the potential incongruency, let's say, between our intentions and actualization, we may become more self-reflexive and perhaps be better to adapt how we position ourselves according to different life situations. So ultimately, grasping historical consciousness's cognitive and cultural workings and how these affect our sense making in the now, I believe can point to new directions for understanding how we function as humans, individuals, and members of different communities. As history works, as our embodied understanding of history works to maintain our sense of dignity and integrity, to make us feel complete and more fulfilled as humans, examining historical consciousnesses working self-reflexively can offer potentials of self-discovery and inner expansion through better knowing the self and the other. There are many audiences for the book. Teachers can obviously use it for pedagogical purposes. Community leaders can gain insight into their sense making and how they can solve historically rooted social problems, like the different mindsets that arise. Academic students, learners of history will have new insight, or I'm basically picking up on a conversation that was left off, starting with probably even before, like Carl Becker, William James, the pragmatist theorist, even talked about a little bit about the specious present, and it's picked up in Carl Becker. So all this ideas of pragmatism and using history for practical life purposes has a history. And at one point, even in West Germany, if I remember correctly, not that I was there, but in the readings I've done, in the 70s and 80s, historical consciousness became a concept to focus on by didacticians. It started off that way, but then I think my argument is that didacticians were not able to escape from the power of history being what historians do. So that kind of deviated. So I'm kind of with this book, I'm trying to get back into that. And for philosophers and theorists, trying to get back into the practical life approaches to history. And for philosophers and theorists, this book will offer a new way of bringing different strands of pragmatism, phenomenology, existentialism, hermeneutics, cultural anthropology, history theory, indigenous knowledge systems together. And I do so via a mediated action understanding of our meaning makings. And the general public would basically also gain insights into how they use history in their everyday lives. The next steps, I also have a wonderful team of colleagues around the world who have believed in me, and they have tested the methodology in different multi-site settings. They're testing its applicability and validity, and and I can assure you that the data is so interesting. So I have team members in Ireland, Israel, Greece, and the USA. So I'd like to thank and honor Katrina Anya Cassidy and Peter Whelan from Dublin City University, Nimrod Tal from Kibbutzim College of Education, Technology and Arts, the Israeli Institute of History Education, and Simcha Getune from Kibbutzim College of Education, Technology and Arts. I'd like to also thank Eleni Apostolidou from the University of Ioannina, the Hellenic Open University, and Gabriel Rich from Virginia Commonwealth University. So I want to thank them for believing in me and being patient. And I'm sure they're enjoying, from what I understand, they're enjoying the project. And so just to let you know, there's a book coming out soon, and it's the follow-up to this book. And so it's one where we test and apply and validate the methodology. We add on to it, and we also contribute to other overarching conversations. So please stay tuned. And one last thing, I have a website now and a podcast. It's on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. It's called History in the Now, which is the way I conceive of historical consciousness. And if you type in historyinthenow.com, and you'll see a list of all of my podcasts. And what's interesting about the podcast is that I interview and talk to people this season, it's mainly academics, and they don't work directly in the field of history, but I interview them and I ask them questions, and they talk about how they use history in their lives and in their work. So it's really interesting. So non-historian specialists talking about history, and it's just fascinating. And I obviously refer to the book, and I use certain parts of the book in helping structure the podcast. So I would like to thank everyone for your attention. Thank you.